All right. So basically what we're going to do is kind of take a look at the open PRs and open source for the data modeling behind access controls. And so representing that in our product. One of the, we'll start with basically taking a look at the existing implementation that we have that was contributed earlier by PayPal and kind of a high level overview of exactly how that works. And then we'll take a look at a couple other PRs and kind of like the differences in those designs. And then after this, we'll actually take a look at one of those PRs and like what can be built on top of these data models. One thing I do want to call out is that these PRs, except for the one that's already been merged, are essentially data model PRs, which means that there's no UI components to them yet, which would eventually come be built on top of that, are the data model PRs. All right, next slide. All right, so let's take a look at the first kind of what exists in the system today. We can define an external role, and essentially an external role could be something, for example, like an IAM role in AWS that ultimately has the privileges and permissions for you to access data on the system. Within DataHub, what you'll see is you'll see a link essentially to request access via an external system. And so this might be useful if you already have an existing external system which is already managing your requests. The external system is responsible for essentially provisioning access to that IAM role. And then it's also responsible for updating the status, the fact that it was provisioned back into DataHub. So this is, again, it's a very lightweight kind of touch, and definitely relies on a lot of external integration with DataHub in order to actually make this work. Next. And so we have a couple of different pieces of the data model that kind of controls this, and it's pretty simple. On a data set, you basically have a list of role associations. So these roles would give you access to that data set in AWS, for example. And part of that role, you get to name the role, add a description, a little bit of information about whether it's a read, admin, write level access request, and then that external URL that you can then is exposed in the UI, so you can go and request access through that external system. And then we also have a list of the actors, the data hub identities that have been granted access to that role. Go ahead next. So one thing that I definitely recommend is you can go back to the November 2023 town hall, and this screenshot is from that particular town hall, where we actually show what this looks like in the UI. So if you create these roles and establish, write the external request URL, this is what it looks like. You have an access management tab, and you basically have a little button you can click to request access. And then the status and everything else like that, everything that's updating this, like provisioning and things like that, is handled by the external system. But this is what it would look like, what it does look like in the UI today. All right. So then we have a couple other kind of extensions to this kind of idea of access controls or access requests within DataHub, and how would we model those in a little bit different way. The first PR here is basically one of the nice things is extending it. So not just data sets, but you can also kind of represent access requests to containers or data products, which are essentially end up being collections of data sets, not just individual data sets. The data modeling piece is storing a bunch of this information about, the request status and all this information in a generic map of strings. And just calling back this particular PR doesn't include the UI components. One of the ways that you might actually automate the provisioning would actually be to use the DataHub Actions framework. So you would respond to changes in this map structure, and then you would execute those provisioning steps within your data platform. In other cases, the UI can deep link into data platform systems that support it. And what that means is you can expose URLs in the UI that drops you to the appropriate admin section if you happen to be an admin within the platform, BigQuery, for example, in order to grant that access. So it's essentially linking to the places where you could provision it manually as a user as well. All right, next slide. And so this is relatively similar to the other. We have entities that are supported, like I said, dataset container, data products, and then we have a list of access requests. And we basically just have a map string of string. The content of this is largely undefined in the model, and it would depend on higher layers of code in order to interpret the data that's stored in the additional metadata map. All right, next. So we have another PR that was proposed, which is taking a little bit more defined approach. So defined in the sense that it goes to a lot of detail about exactly what the schema looks like for supporting access requests. There are different states, but the one of the major changes here is that the access request is a entity. So that means it is kind of like its own individual concept. And then one of the benefits of being able to model as an entity is we can use it for searching and filtering those access requests. This particular data model also goes into detailing fine-grained access controls, and then also, kind of inherent support for multiple data platforms. And again, the actions framework could be used to actually do the provisioning. It's not part of this PR. Next. All right. So we have in this particular design, we have a top level entity called data access. That data access is actually has a composite key of a identity or principal within the data platform and the particular data set. And so you basically have a mapping in this particular entity between a DataHub user and one or more identities on the actual data platform itself. So this has information about, I'm user David, but I might be user David L in BigQuery or, some other ID. So this supports kind of keeping track of both things. Some of the detail that it goes into is kind of like defining the status information about this particular access request, pending, revoked, expired, various failure states, and being able to expose all of this information in the UI potentially. And it also supports things like time-limited requests, like I would like to grant access or request access for this particular data set for a month or a day or something like that. And one thing you'll note there, I didn't call it out on the slide, but the data access properties does include things like field level or fine-grained access in here as well. All right, next. So both of these PRs are really kind of focused on the data model. And so what could we do with this data model in the future? So none of this is in the current PRs. This is like what is this information useful if it does exist in DataHub? One of the things that we'd, ideally have is 100% read fidelity, meaning that you'd be able to look at the actual policies in the native format. If you're dealing with a lot of different data platforms, one of the challenges with dealing with different data platforms is that the way you define policies and what controls you can create vary widely. So it's more so that DataHub would not necessarily be the source of truth, just because supporting every single different variation is going to be a lot of work. But at least you could actually look at the native policy if needed. If we do have some of this information, say like I don't want to say lowest common denominator, but at least some of that information kind of in a more structured format, we can definitely use it to do things like auditing access controls across lineage. You might have a particular protected column, for example, and you actually want to know who has access to that particular column across any data set, regardless of where it is in a complex lineage. So, BigQuery, or like in the various different places where that column exists, right? Kind of understanding, where all the data platform, where does this column exist, and who has access to that location in each of those places. Another interesting concept that we could potentially use if we had, access request information is view access controls. You might have a dynamic policy that basically says, based on the access controls in the data platform, that could determine your access within DataHub. So if you don't have access to a particular data set on the data platform, we could deny you access to look at that entity's page. We could also create search views, so predefined views that are based on showing you data sets that you have access to individually, or perhaps your group or your team, and kind of get that curated view of what you do have access to. And um, one of the things that we could do as well is kind of allow you to switch back and forth in and out of that view in case you still need to discover, additional data sets that you don't yet have access to and be able to request it as well. And then the final piece there is going to be the provisioning framework. So a lot of the provisioning is in these current PRs is handled by external systems. So that means you're deep linking into BigQuery, for example, to provide that access controls, or you have an external system. And so having a framework to kind of handle that provisioning for you, maybe a couple examples or something like that. The only thing to kind of recognize there is that like if you define a policy in DataHub, it's never going to be 100% representative of what you can do in that platform. And that non-uniformity across data platform access control policies is going to be a constant challenge. And so it's going to pretty much always require some sort of customization. But certainly there are certain a baseline that could be implemented with a common framework. And that's it for my slides.